Hello, everyone. Today's session is going to focus on the composition standards within the reading and writing standards. It's probably my number one request from schools and teachers is help with writing. So today, myself, Carole Mullins, and Rebecca King, who is a high school English teacher at Pikeville Independent and was also a part of the Reading and Writing Standards Review and Development Committee, will be joining me to, once we give you some clarification about the intent of the standards, of some of the writing standards, Rebecca will share a strategy that helps us begin with the end in mind, which beginning writing with the composition standards, we want to talk about thesis statements. The terminology of thesis has dropped down to the elementary school level also. So we decided that, if you want a student to have a strong, on-demand written response, that starting with a thesis statement and teaching kids strategies for those is the most important. So that's what we're going to do today. So our learning goal, obviously, is to build a shared understanding that teaching students how to write effective thesis statements, it satisfies the guiding principles of the composition standards, which our guiding principles are what we want students to know and be able to do by the time they leave high school. The thesis statement establishes the basis for teaching all the composition standards in writing for all grade levels and all subject areas. Sometimes a thesis statement, we have a tendency to think, that's only belongs in the English language arts class. But when we're looking at our composition standards and our Kentucky academic standards for reading and writing, and then we think about our social studies standards and our science standards, when we're talking about writing thesis statements, we're also calling them claim statements. So even though we're using the terminology of thesis, it's across all content areas. It's not intended to be only English language arts. Now, the thesis or / claim statement, it develops essential student writing skills for passage-based writing in all subject areas, whether that written assignment is timed or untimed. So we're including on-demand writing within teaching kids how to write effective thesis or claim statements. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the thesis statements related to the composition standards. When we look at Standard 1, obviously we're talking about argumentation, and students will compose arguments to support claims in an analysis of substantive topics or texts using valid reasoning and relevant and sufficient evidence. That is a lot. And, this, again, these are the guiding principles. This is what we want kids to know and be able to do by the time they leave high school. But even an individual grade level standard for Standard 1 encompasses quite a bit. So how do we help students get started writing? That's where the thesis / claim statement comes into play. Same thing with Standard 2, which is about composing informative and explanatory writing. It's text to examine and convey complex ideas clearly and accurately through the effective selection, organization, and analysis. So when we're talking about both of these kinds of writing, so many of the skills are similar, and what you're going to see on the screen are a few important points that come from both standards 1 and 2. These are things that are in common for any kind of writing. To produce clear and coherent writing, where the development, organization, and style are appropriate to the task, the purpose, and audience. And that task, purpose, and audience obviously is found in the teacher written assignment, the task. We want students to be able to introduce claims, acknowledge and distinguish opposing claims, and counter or refute them, and organize the reasons and evidence logically. Now, just looking at bullet number 2, that's a big task. And once students have done the pre-work for getting ready to write, how do they take all that information? Well, we have to help them get started. And the thesis statement, knowing how to structure a thesis statement, really helps the student get focused. And Rebecca will elaborate on that more as we go through the strategy she's going to share with you. Another point that's the same in both kinds of writing: introduce a topic clearly, organize ideas, concepts, and information into broader categories, include formatting, graphics, and multimedia when useful to aiding comprehension. Establish and maintain a task-appropriate writing style, or as is stated in the informative and explanatory, formal writing style. You know, you may be writing an essay, an argumentative essay, or you may be writing an informative, explanatory type of writing. It may be in the task. Here's the bottom line that I really want to emphasize to you. A student they will not receive a proficient or distinguished score on-demand writing without a strong thesis statement or claim that includes the 3 parts that Rebecca's going to share with you today in her strategy. And, at first I started to call this session a 3-part thesis statement, and I thought, that's not all this session is about. It's about the 3 parts, obviously, but the importance of how those 3 parts help a student get focused in order to write a high-level response. So, the thesis statement is important because it tells the audience what they'll be reading about. It sets the stage, and it helps both the reader and the writer. One thing that students, they have a problem getting started, and the thesis statement helps get that focus. But the next big piece in both kinds of writing we're looking at, argumentation or informative, they have to provide a concluding statement or a section that supports the argument or the information or explanation they're presenting. So if we kind of summed up a little bit or did a little bit of analogy, the thesis statement is like the foundation of a building. If you have a shaky foundation, then your building will not be structurally sound. The same thing goes for our thesis statements and strong claims. If you have a weak thesis or claim from the very beginning, your paper, the student's writing is going to be unstable, and it's obviously going to lead to lower scores. And I was reading a blog, and I just wanted to share what this was a content area teacher who made this statement and said, essays without a thesis or claim statements are easy to grade. You simply write an F at the top of the paper, laugh, and shuffle on to the next paper. The point in that, though, is unfortunately not teaching kids the skills they need for this thesis or claim statement is the sign of a really weak teacher. So we have to take this seriously and give our students the strategies they need to be successful in writing. So in summing up and getting ready to move on to Rebecca sharing a strategy with you, I'm going back to remember, always begin with the end in mind, because the thesis claim statement will increase the quality of a student's timed or untimed written assignment response for you. The one thing that always helps a student meet the intent of the composition standards and become a better writer in all their classes, not just English, is having that strong, clear thesis or claim statement. What I've just shared with you, all writing styles are different, but a strong thesis or claim to begin what they're writing about is the same. It's the same thing, all content areas, it's all in common. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, and she is going to share a strategy that she has had much success in helping her students at the high school level to be successful in writing thesis and claim statements. But a couple of years ago, she actually shared with students in the elementary schools how to help their students write. So she's gonna share this with you. So Rebecca, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Okay, Carole. So I like to think about composing a thesis as sort of drawing a map for a student's essay. And I use that analogy with my students and tell them that in order to get to a destination, you have to have a plan, you have to have a map. And sometimes if you can help students to get their thinking to a point where they have a focused, clear thesis statement, then the rest of the essay is the easy part because they already know what their points are and what they're doing. And so if they can start with a strong thesis and then you can teach them. So I kind of approach teaching composition, timed or untimed, doesn't make any difference which kind of writing my students are going to be doing. I still approach it basically from the same idea of starting with showing them how to get a strong thesis statement first, and then how do I take that thesis statement and develop it effectively into a strong body for my essay. And then finally, we work on conclusions. How do I make sure that what I've said had an impact and tie it all together? And so we always start first with the thesis statement because it gives you that map for your final destination, which hopefully will be an effective essay. And so I really am unsure exactly where I came to this place where this is what I use. But I've been in several trainings over the years where other teachers did similar things. Sometimes they called it condition, phrase, claim, and support. And then other times they call it something different. There's several books that I've read that have a similar idea of thesis statement. And so while I can't really credit one individual with the three-part thesis statement, it's something that if you do any amount of research, you'll see that it's a common thread in how to structure a thesis statement is what we're doing here. So I have 3 different examples on the screen because I wanted you to see that it doesn't really matter what type of prompt a student is given. They can still ultimately use this 3-part thesis statement to make sure that they are focused and clear and that their reader knows at the beginning where they intend to take them. And so the first one is an example that I use a lot of times. I use this example with my AP literature students because they're going to be doing things like character analysis. They're going to be doing poetry explications where they're going to be talking about a work of literature. And so I tweak the thesis a little bit to fit that idea. So in this first one, the condition phrase is simply really the author and the title of the work they're going to talk about. In Stephen King's Strawberry Spring, so that the reader knows what work you're discussing, you would be amazed at how many students, if you don't give them that instruction first, will jump right into talking about a work of literature and never once mention what that work is or who the author is. So this helps make sure they do that. The narrator is unreliable. That is my claim. That is what I'm going to discuss and prove in the course of my literary analysis. Why do I think he's unreliable? Because he is an insane murderer. Now that seems simplistic, but if you read the story, that's a perfectly legitimate claim and support. And so I have a condition phrase which gives a context for what I'm going to talk about. And that's important. You want your reader to have a context for the discussion you're going to bring them into, because without that context, it's kind of like walking up to the lunch table and your friends are already having a conversation and you sit down and you contribute without having any idea what came before. And lots of times if you do that, that doesn't work out well. So it's better to have a context first. The second example is an example of a thesis that I would use for an argumentative prompt. I think that this actually came from probably a released item for on-demand writing. But you start again with a context or a condition phrase for context. While many argue against the use of cell phones in school. So I've started with basically the opposing claim. And if you think about that standard and the things that Carole told you before we started this, you one of the jobs that you want students to learn to do every time is to always acknowledge that opposing claim. If you teach them to set their thesis statement up this way, they really can't miss the boat on that. They're going to acknowledge the opposing claim, and it sort of sets up the rest of their essay as a refutation of that claim. Now, you can deal with that differently, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but you for sure are going to get them, they're going to hit that part of the standard, and they're going to hit that on the rubric. They're going to have acknowledged the opposing claim. Then you always have to have your own claim. This is a place where sometimes students struggle because I try really hard to move them away from I think, I feel, I believe, simply because in academic writing, it's better not to do those things. It's not personal writing, it's academic writing, and so it should be in that academic third person one. And so I try to keep it in third person and teach them that if they think it, then they can write it in their paper, and whoever reads it will know that it's their thought. So that's a struggle, but it's something to work on. So my claim here, they are useful classroom tools. That's what I think. I didn't say I think it, but that's what I think, and I put it down because it's my claim. Now, you always have to have support, and you teach your kids to always put that in their thesis statement, because once they have their 3 supports or their 1 support or their 2 supports, how many ever they choose, they have a roadmap for how they're going to develop the body of their essay. So because they provide access to the internet, to 911, and to online learning tools, those are the 3 reasons why I think that cell phones are useful classroom tools. So if I'm writing this essay, I'm going to be able to develop those 3 points into a very clear, organized, coherent essay, which is what you want students to be able to do. So that would be an example I would use if I were going to do an argumentative essay with my students. Now, informative writing can obviously a lot of times take a more personal turn and be a personal essay, but it's still going to be explanatory, informative. So you still have to give people a context for how you come to be explaining something to them, or how you are a knowledgeable person on the subject. So in my condition phrase on this one, I start with, although I grew up working on a tobacco farm, and in just that brief little condition phrase there, I have explained to my reader that I grew up on a tobacco farm, which makes me an expert on the subject of growing up on tobacco farms, and gives me a reason why I would be explaining or talking about anything to do with that. I knew from an early age farming was not for me. I knew from an early age farming was not for me because I loved reading and writing much more than cultivating tobacco. So I knew from an early age farming was not for me is my claim. And I've already established a context for why I can make that claim. And then I have my support because I loved reading and writing much more than cultivating tobacco. So if I'm going to develop my essay, then I'm going to have to talk about how I discovered this love of reading and writing and why it was more appealing to me than cultivating tobacco, that thing. So that is an example of an explanatory thesis statement. So you want to give students, you want to show them that this is like it's almost a formula. I guess it is a formula technically, but it works in whatever situation they're in as a writer. They're going to need a thesis statement, and if they always set it up like this, then they're always going to have a roadmap for where they're going.
Right, and I think that is one of the problems that has happened with our, especially with our middle school students and high school students too. Again, it's just that getting started. So we expect them to write a good response, high-level response, without giving them, I like the term you said, a formula. They're going to, as they grow as writers, they're going to expand on this, but they have to have a skill to get started. And I think we can safely say that when we talk about, like you said, you've put a lot of different researchers and things together to come up with and chose to use condition, phrase, claim, support. We just give them, like you said, a little roadmap.
Right, and students will, and I will also say that some of your higher level, those gifted writers who are going to be distinguished, whether we do any one thing or not with them, they're not going to need this. They're not. And you don't have to force them to do it. If they're already a distinguished writer and they're producing lovely work of their own, then they don't need this, and you don't need to force them to do this. But the thing is, most of the students that I've encountered, this is the single most effective thing at improving their writing. If you have a high apprentice student, as a rule, if you can teach them to write a thesis statement like this and develop it, that student's ready to learn that, and it will move them immediately up to a proficient score because they will have focus and they will stay on topic, and that is so important if you look at what proficient writing calls for on the rubric. So that's an important thing to remember. I'm going to go through these other slides kind of quickly because I think I mostly talked through most of what I was going to say on these slides on this one. And so just to reiterate, condition phrase, it can acknowledge the opposing claim, or it creates a context for your main idea, or it gives the title and author of the text to which you will refer. It depends on the type of writing you're doing, but your condition phrase basically gives a context. It makes it gives a reason why you would be writing. If you're acknowledging the opposing claim, then that gives a reason why you want to make your claim. So that's an important thing to remember.
One of the things, and I'm sure you've already caught on to it, we haven't really said it out loud, but these are color-coded. And there is an important reason for that with a resource we're going to give you to help kids learn how to do these. So when you're seeing the red, you're seeing the condition phrase, the green, the claim, and the brownish gold is the support. And so that kids actually visually see it in their mind's eye.
And it does help them to see this. So you can see they're all color-coded, and basically the condition phrases are sort of all there. The claim within their thesis statement is basically what claim is across the board in any content area. If you say claim to students, that should say to them a statement of your position or your main idea. That's what claim is.
And this addresses Kim Sargent, who is the social studies instructional specialist. She and I work together quite a bit, and they basically don't use the word thesis a lot, but they use claim. Same difference. These same three strategies would be important in a social studies written assignment as much as it would be in an English or science.
And I will say that one of my colleagues who's a social studies teacher has used this with her kids with much success. Now, support is something that is basically, it's your evidence or your examples to support your claim or your reasons. And I tell my students 1 to 3 reasons, and I know that there are people who say, oh, you have to have 3 points in order for it to be an essay and all of that, but I disagree respectfully with that. I think that it is much more important for a student to be able to develop well how many ever pieces of evidence they have. If I just tack something on so I have 3, but I have no discussion, no evidence, no real thinking to support that, that's going to weaken my essay. It's going to be better if I only have 2 good, strong pieces of evidence that I can really talk about and explain and analyze and make connections with. That's going to be more effective writing than just working to get 3 reasons. And I have over the years had students like on practice timed writings and things, they would write fiercely for a few minutes and then they would stop and just sit there and have this look of panic on their face. And I'm like, what's wrong? I can't think of a 3rd reason. I can't think of a 3rd reason, Miss King. And I'm like, well, then move on. And they're horrified at first, but then when they move on, they end up with something. So I tell them 1 to 3 reasons because I want them to learn that it's about the development of your support and that the support you use has to effectively support your thesis statement. It has to prove what your claim was. If you don't prove your claim, it doesn't matter how much evidence you give. If that evidence isn't relevant and sufficient to prove your claim. So that's important to remember with support. So in this example, I have 3 supports, and in the previous example, I only really had 2 supports. But either way is going to be okay because I can develop those, and that's what matters in the end. Now, grammar is important. Contrary to whatever anybody else might say, grammar is important in writing. It's important for kids to internalize grammatical rules and for them to understand and be able to apply them effectively. So I break down as much as possible the grammar included in this sort of thesis formula for them. Now, there are exceptions where the condition phrase may not always be a dependent clause. Sometimes it's just a phrase, but it's never going to be an independent clause. You know, it may be a dependent clause, it may be a phrase, but it's not going to be an independent clause. So on this example, I have a dependent clause. It starts with a subordinating conjunction. I teach my kids what subordinating conjunctions are, even though they're in 11th grade. Surprisingly, often, they have forgotten everything that you diligent 2nd grade teachers taught them, and I know that you did. But they have forgotten that, and they no longer think subordinating conjunction when they see a word like although or while. And so I give them a list and we review so that they know what a subordinating conjunction is, so that when I say begin your condition phrase with a subordinating conjunction, they do so. So while some argue against the use of seatbelts, so this is argumentative, I have acknowledged my opposing claim in my condition phrase, and I have put a comma between my dependent clause and my independent clause because that's the comma rule. Okay, so when you're teaching this thesis statement, you can also teach students comma rules. There's 2 in this that are really important that they have to know and need to learn, And so this is a golden opportunity to teach grammar and writing at the same time because they are married. So my comma comes before the dependent clause, before the independent clause, because the dependent clause came at the beginning of my sentence. That is a comma rule. When the dependent clause comes before the independent clause, the comma comes after the dependent clause. The other rule is if the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, there is no comma. So they can also learn that rule because the independent clause, which is my claim, always is an independent clause. Seatbelts save lives is followed by another dependent clause, which also begins with a subordinating conjunction because they cut the risk of injury in a crash in half and reduce the risk of ejection significantly, period. There's no comma after the independent clause if it's followed by a dependent clause. So there's 2 comma rules that you can, like, every time you go over it, you can remind them of those comma rules. And, those comma rules will be on the ACT. So you're getting a lot of bang for your buck with just teaching the grammar for your thesis statement. So that's important. Okay, Carole.
I want to share with you the instructional resources that are embedded within this presentation for you. As you can see, there's a Google Drive link, and there are actually 2 activities. There's a thesis analysis activity. We have about 10 thesis statements for students to analyze, and the PowerPoint that you're seeing can actually be used. Those slides can be used to teach students before you do the activity.
And Carole, one thing that you can do with this activity that I like to do with my students is I will give them a time to response, and then I take it home with me and I pull their thesis statements, and I'll pull 10 or 12 randomly, good ones, bad ones in between. And then the next day I'll type them up anonymously and I'll take them in, and we'll do this same activity, but we do it with their thesis statements. And I have them, go through and rank them and then correct them and do all that. And that's very effective because they're working from, like, I did this prompt. I know what my thesis was. Okay, how does it, So it's a very effective strategy. It takes a little bit of prep work, but it's well worth it in the instructional
awesome.
benefit.
So I think we can safely say probably some of these we've created were your students' work.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
That
So
was one
we're seeing actual
yeah.
student work. The other resource is a thesis activity template where we have the fill in the blank and beginning practices of writing thesis. So both of those, the link will be the same all the way through the presentation for the Google Drive, but we're just going to point out that you do have some resources that you can take back and use with your students.
Okay, this next activity is actually, this is how I move on to the second part of, like, helping kids to be able to develop an essay well. Once they have that thesis statement, if you can teach them to basically take their support, and for each of their supports, they're going to develop a paragraph that has 4 parts. Now, be careful and don't say 4 sentences, because you don't want a paragraph with 4 sentences. Most likely, I mean, if you're elementary, you'll probably be really happy with 4 sentences. But at the middle school and high school level, you're going to want more. I teach my kids that they're looking to develop parts, because if they do parts, they're going to come up with well-developed essays. They're going to come up with paragraphs that have 10 and 12 and 13 sentences, not just 4. So it's important to teach them that these are the parts. So I always start with this, 35-year-old graphic here that came from a college textbook years ago. And I like to use this with my students because I show them this is what I learned when I was in college that an effective essay is. And in all these years after college, that still hasn't changed. So if you can learn this, if you can learn the structure of an essay, then you're set. It's not going to change. Nobody's going to go back and rewrite what an essay is or how an essay is structured. And so you're good. And so I like to show them this first, that you always start your essay with a thesis statement, and then that you're going to have a topic sentence, you're going to have supporting statements, and a concluding sentence in every paragraph. But that is, in and of itself, is not as helpful as it may seem to us for students. They really need more help with, okay, what does that look like? How do I do that? And so T helps me to break that down. And so regardless of what grade level you're teaching, the work looks much different when you're in K1. And we spent most of last year at Pikeville working from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade to develop a writing plan that was cohesive, so that no matter where kids, that everybody was kind of teaching the same basic ideas and concepts and using the same tools. And so if I'm a kindergarten or first grade student, I'm not able yet cognitively to do a paragraph that looks like the graphic on the page here. I'm not. But I am most likely able to write a topic sentence. I'm able to write a claim. You may have to help me, but if I say to Carole, "Do you like pizza?" she's most likely going to say,
"Yes, I love pizza."
And that in and of itself is a claim. Yes, I love pizza. And you say to the student, "I love pizza," is a claim. And then they have written a claim. And then you teach them about support. What do you like about pizza?
I like that it always has lots of cheese on it.
And there, you see, is a reason. And I talk to kids about that. So the work looks different at different levels, but the concept and the idea is the same. You're moving toward that final guiding principle at the 12th grade, but you have to give them that effective foundation from the beginning.
Right, and I like the fact that you have used the terminology, because the terminology of claim is in the kindergarten, first, second, third grade standards now. That is one of the additions to the revised standards, is the terminology. So as a K-3 teacher, be very cognizant and look at the standards for the terminology and go ahead and be using it with kids.
And the idea behind those revisions in the standards realistically is that why not teach kids the correct terminology in the beginning? There's no reason why that you should teach them talking marks for quotation marks, because you know what? If they can remember talking marks, they can remember quotation marks. And then they don't have to relearn quotation marks later. So I'm a big advocate for just calling things what they are from the beginning. I think that that's important for students. So this is a graphic, and I have this on organizers that I give out to my students at the beginning of the year to keep in their folder.
Yes, and it's actually located in the link that you saw on the other slides, and we'll see on the upcoming slides, so that you can print this and put this in student hands.
So, and it's a good reference for students. And when I first start out my year, I let students have this out. When I ask them to write something, I'm like, get out all of your organizers and things, and I let them use it. Because if you don't let them practice with it, then they're not going to internalize that so that they can do it on their own. So for every paragraph, I tell my students that they have to have a topic sentence. And I basically teach them, take your first support. And develop it into a paragraph. So if I were using that earlier example where I talk about cell phones and I say that it allows me access to the internet, if that is my first point, then my topic sentence in my first paragraph would say that explicitly. Then I'm going to provide an example. And here's the beautiful thing. When they're doing passage-based writing prompts, which I feel like gives students the most opportunity to show that they're an effective writer. If they're doing a passage-based prompt, if you can teach them to pull a direct quote from the outside source, from that passage, or if you can teach them to give a specific relevant example. And that's hard for students to grasp specific relevant examples because sometimes they think if they just do something that's a very broad general example that that's good enough, but it's really not. It needs to be something that's really specific and directly related to that point. And if you can use sources, give direct quotes, give that kind of information, then that is going to help you establish authority as an author. And that's something that's very important in effective arguments, which is primarily the focus that we want students to have. And then the analysis. And this is where most of the time when we see apprentice writers, this is where they struggle. Maybe they've done a topic sentence and they were able to pull an example, but they really don't know what to do with it once they have it. And so I like to tell them that the analysis part of their paragraph is the answer to the question, how do we, the reader, know that this supports or proves your thesis? How do I know? How did this example that you gave me, how did it prove what you said in your thesis about access to the internet? How does this prove it? And if you can teach them that they're always answering that question, when they actually answer that question, sometimes they have 3 or 4 good, strong sentences that says how it proves what they said. So teaching them that that's what the analysis part is, not just restating. A lot of times in the beginning, students want to just say what the quote said again, and that isn't analysis. So you have to really work with helping them to know that there's a question and they have to answer that question. And then address the question. This is where you create cohesion for your essay. If you teach students that they always need a sentence or two that makes it clear that you answered the question posed in the prompt, clearly tie it back to that thesis statement, then they're going to have a stronger essay in the end. So in this next example here, if I start with this thesis statement, although many argue against the use of cell phones in school, they are useful classroom tools because they provide access to the internet, to 911, and to online learning tools which improve the overall learning environment. Now, that's my thesis statement. And then this is an example of what a student might do with a body paragraph. And you'll notice immediately that you have 4 different colors here because I color-coded it so you can see how the parts come together. So my topic sentence is, cell phones provide access to the internet, which has much information and many resources. Okay, so that's directly from my thesis statement, access to the internet. So it's clear that I'm still focused on what I started with. According to cell phones in school, yes. With research capabilities, students may more quickly access information they need for the task they are completing. So this is a quote from the passage that I got with the prompt. And then here's my analysis. As this article points out, research on the internet is quick and easy. Students are able to use online dictionaries, databases, and library resources from their cellular devices. As well, Google and other search engines yield quick results. So I haven't just restated what the quote said, but I've elaborated on how this answers the question. Okay, how that cell phones provide access, what kind of access. And then I'm going to circle back to my question. While students need to be taught to properly vet sources found online, there is little question that online research via cell phones is useful in a classroom setting. Okay, so my prompt was basically, are they, should cell phones be allowed? Are they useful classroom tools? So I have in that last addressed the question, while students need to be taught to properly vet sources found online, I am acknowledging, right, the opposing claim that there can be bad things online, but I'm reiterating my answer to the question the prompt addressed, which is that online research is a useful classroom tool. So hopefully your students would end up with something of this nature if they make sure they have the parts. And so I like to practice with my students and model for them. So I always start off with a lesson similar to this, where I'll show them a color-coded paragraph and we go through the whole process. I don't just say, write me a paragraph after I show them the graphic organizer. We scaffold it so that they know what they're doing. So one activity that I like to do to model for students, and Carole has put this activity in the drive for you as well.
Yes.
And I use highlighters, or actually somebody at one of the trainings we did last year gave me this tip, and it's a beautiful idea. Colored pencils. They're so much cheaper than highlighters, and you can just keep whichever colors you decide to use. So they work great for this activity too, I discovered. So if you take a different color highlighter and you're going to have them, you give them the task and you give them the thesis statement, and then you give them a paragraph that has T in it, and you have them find the parts. So in this example, I used the prompt basically was, should nations use economic sanctions as a political tool? And the thesis statement was, though economic sanctions appear to be a powerful peacetime weapon, so there's my condition phrase, they actually do more harm than good, there's my claim, because they often prolong bad situations, reduce dialogue between disputing nations, and harm innocent victims with little impact on those in power. So this is going to be my thesis statement. So the first thing that I would teach my students that I should have done is to take that first point, they often prolong bad situations, and turn that into the topic sentence of my first body paragraph. And so this is the body paragraph here. Economic sanctions often prolong bad situations rather than end them. Political sanctions usually come about when an international dispute cannot be resolved by discussion and compromise. So in my topic sentence, I took exactly what my thesis said, basically, turned it into my topic sentence. In order for one nation to get what it wants, it reduces or stops trade with another nation. It may also freeze any assets the offending nation has invested in its country. Okay, so the first part of this is basically set up for the example I'm going to give. In 1962, for example, but it works as example under T because I'm giving specific explanation, facts, right? Specific explanation of what economic sanctions are, because my reader needs that. In 1962, for example, communist leader Fidel Castro took power in Cuba. His government took control of U.S. businesses there. The United States imposed sanctions, cutting trade with Cuba, hoping this would speed the fall of Castro's government. United States sanctions. You see that I've cited my source because this quote came from a source, right? It's a specific quote. More than 40 years later, the sanctions remained in place and Castro remained in power. Now, all of that part there would be my example. So in this example, my example is much bigger than my analysis or my address the question, but I need more, so it's okay. Clearly, in this case, economic sanctions prolonged a bad situation which might have been reconciled through stronger efforts at diplomacy. So I answered that question. How did this example prove my thesis, right? That's what all my analysis needed to do. So I answered that question. Then I want to circle back to my prompt, which was, should nations use economic sanctions as a political tool? Cuba is one example among many of why economic sanctions should not be a political tool. So you see how I went clearly back to the prompt there. And that's what you want to teach kids to do. You want to teach them that there's always going to be those 4 parts in their body paragraphs. Now, as your students grow and mature and become stronger writers, there are more things that you can teach them that will help them to improve. But realistically, if you can get all of your students to do a 3-part thesis and use T to develop their body paragraphs, you're going to have some proficient writers most likely. So that's the thing to remember. Now, the whole idea of giving kids formulas and teaching them, letting them practice the way that they should do things correctly is not a new idea. There's a wonderful book, They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing. And I took this slide from that book, and it offers many more templates than this. But if you can teach kids to use these types of statements to make their arguments and to integrate that into their essays smoothly, it helps to elevate their writing tremendously, and it helps them to be able to articulate their thinking clearly so that somebody else can read what they've written and understand it. So I really like these just because it's helpful for students to have something to go to pull from. So it helps you to kind of pull together the ideas and relationships to your thesis as you're discussing different points.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. Let's also kind of recap what resources are available to work with T. Rebecca alluded to using the colored markers or colored pencil. That is the T activity. Also, you have access to, I'm going to let Rebecca talk just a little bit about this, how her students use it, but we've included an organizer template that has all of this on 2 pages, where students actually can see the connections between thesis statement and T.
And this is something that I do early on to let them practice. And really, I don't make them do this every time at my level, but my freshman English teacher and some of the lower levels do, they have them do this every time, and it works. It's good because that way they make sure they have all the parts. And so it's just really, it's a graphic organizer where they just basically make sure they have all the parts. If they do their rough draft on this, essentially, and you can, this is it's a Google Doc, so you could share it in Google Classroom or in Schoology or one of those places, so that in Google Classroom especially, you could share it and the students could then type their rough draft, which sometimes is a beautiful thing. So you could still have a typed rough draft and have them use the organizer.
Right, and I would personally, I think this organizer is very appropriate at 4th and 5th grade. It really helps set the stage. These are the important things you have to know are included in your written response. And then you see on the screen the They Say, I Say template that was on the previous slide. We also have that for you to be able to copy and share with your students.
Okay, the conclusion. Now, this is a place where a lot of times students really, by the time they get to the conclusion, if it's a timed setting, a lot of times they are out of time and they're in a hurry, so they don't have a lot of time to do a so what. So it's really important for them to practice conclusions, and it's really important for you to reassure them that even if their conclusion isn't perfect, and it isn't the most effective paragraph in their essay, if they've done everything else well, they're still able to score proficient, even if they do in conclusion or as you can see. I mean, those are not the best, but they show a score that the student does understand, what a conclusion is. So that's something to tell students. But your goal should be for them to understand that the end of an essay is, it should convey a sense of completeness and closure, but a sense of lingering possibilities of the topic. Like, you haven't said everything there is to say about this subject, right? Sometimes it has a larger meaning. There's implications from what you said. So the final paragraph should close the discussion without closing it off. They haven't said everything that could be said. They've only said what they think about it. So that's important. The questions that help students with conclusions: why does what you said matter? And sometimes when you ask kids that question, they look at you like you're crazy. And they're like, I don't know. And you have to really make them think, why does what you said matter? Why is this important? And if you can teach them to kind of say that at the end of their essay, they're going to have a strong conclusion. And then, how does what you said address the question? That's important, right? In your final paragraph, you have that one last opportunity, especially in an argumentative essay, you have that one last opportunity to say how you have effectively answered that question that was in the prompt.
I do want to slip in here just a minute. As you notice, Rebecca is using the terminology of essay quite a bit, because the word essay is in the standards quite a bit. That doesn't mean that this is not a written response. Essay is one way of a written response. We know we have informational, explanatory, all the types, but even calling it an essay, all of the parts are the same, no matter what kind of written response.
If they're doing a written response, essentially they're going to be writing an essay.
Right.
And I tell my kids that. I'm like, whatever they ask you for, if you're going to write an article for a magazine, if you're going to write a journal article, whatever you're writing, you're essentially always going to have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. If you teach them visual literacy, if you teach them to look at videos online and podcasts and all of those things, the one thing that those things all have in common is an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. I love to do TED Talks with my students on different things, and those TED Talks are beautiful examples of introduction, body, and conclusion. You won't find one where the person who's going to speak doesn't basically set you up for what they're going to discuss it, and then tell you what they discussed. So it's important for kids to get a sense of all the things that are different in writing. If you can teach them the things that are the same, that's what builds a strong writer. So that's important to remember. Now, when they get to the so what, depending on the level of your student, there's different things to teach them. You don't have to teach your kids all of these every time, because that's a lot. But you do want to teach them something, that will be effective. So perhaps, if you're in 4th grade and your kids can summarize the main point in their conclusion, I think that would be good. If they can circle back to the thesis statement and kind of summarize what their main point was and say it again for the reader, then that's a good conclusion. I like to have my kids at the high school, I try to get them to work on leaving the reader with something to think about, or I like for them to discuss the relevance of their topic to the world today, like to make a larger connection, not just what they said or what the passage said, but to think about where does that fall into the larger picture. And sometimes they do that well and sometimes not, but it's a good goal. Using imagery and quotations to tug at a reader's emotions, depending on the type of writing, can be very effective for a conclusion. If you're doing persuasion, argumentative writing, sometimes a call to action is appropriate. Not in all argumentative essays, it's not appropriate, but in a lot of them, a call to action is. If you just spent 3 pages telling me why a certain person is the best candidate for a position, then it's logical for you to call me to vote for them at the end of that essay. That would make sense. Circle back to the thesis statement, reiterating a word or a phrase. Now, when your kids are just starting out in 4th and 5th grade and they're doing the baby steps, restatement is not the end of the world and it's not a bad thing. But by the time they're in, 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, they have to be able to do more than just say their thesis statement again, word for word, in their conclusion.
Right, so that transition needs to take place at middle school.
Yes, they need to start transitioning there.
Moving away from just restating.
Yes, because they have to be able to do something a little more subtle, a little more, a little more significant. Placing your topic in history is a good technique. It's something that that some students can do effectively, especially students who love history and have a real strong background. Like, that makes some of your best writers, actually, because they have a lot to draw on. So that's a good thing.
As you can see, the link is there again at the bottom of the page, because what we've done with this slide is take some highlights from a much bigger document that we're going to give you access to. It comes from the Writing Center at Harvard University. So you will see, once you access the Google Drive, you will see some other information about some tips for writing a conclusion.
And I would also say, Carole, that
Okay.
one of the most effective things you can do is to have students read good writing. Have them read well-written professional essays. Now, those well-written professional essays, a lot of them published, are not going to follow this exactly, right? Because those writers are way beyond what we're teaching here. But when they can see the kinds of conclusions that people like Mark Twain and Stephen King and some really strong writers do, it helps them to build their capacity. So good, strong models of essays, of good writing is important.
Right. That's why our standards are called reading and writing standards. You can't do one without the other. This slide also shows you have access to something, an activity called the Conclusions activity. And personally, I really love this. You give the students, you're going to have an example, you give the students the thesis and the conclusion, and the student determines what technique was used and how they can tell that when that technique was used. So it really helps build their skills of writing conclusions. So it's a great resource too. This concludes what we have decided to share with you today related to our composition standards. You see my email address there below. Please feel free to contact me at any time. And I like to hear from you of ways maybe that you have used these, because I do have a distribution list, and I would love other teachers across the region to share success stories of things you've done. But right now, I know you're all in the countdown because we're back after Christmas break. And so thank you very much for being a part of this training with us.